How are you, man? I'm Gil Roth, and you're listening to a bonus episode of my Virtual Memory Show podcast. This is a COVID check-in episode where I record with a past guest of the Virtual Memory Show to find out how they're holding up during the pandemic. As far as how I'm doing, I'm getting by okay. I got a bunch of podcasts scheduled to record today. It's Saturday, because next week's going to involve a lot of work at my day job, and I want to focus on that without having to put myself in pod conversation mode at weird times, and don't want to give either part of myself short shrift, if you know what I mean. Tomorrow, I'm hoping to get in another long run, the details of which I will share in the weekly podcast email if I pull it off and if I survive. But hey, man, it's a sunny weekend. I get to sit down for conversations with people I like. And after that, I'll read a good book, maybe catch up on that Michael Jordan documentary. I'm not sick. My family members aren't sick. I'm getting by okay. All things considered, that's good, right? Today's guest is also getting by pretty well. He is architecture writer and retired professor Witold Rybczynski, and he's checking in from Philadelphia. Witold and I recorded last year around his lovely book, Charleston Fancy. It was our second full-length episode. He's one of the most thoughtful people I've ever talked to, so I was awfully glad to hear from him, even in this remote mode. But as you'll discover, he's working on a project that I'm really hoping we'll be able to meet again in person to talk about next year. As far as caveats go, not a lot. I tweaked the settings on Zencaster so there's a little more background noise than usual, so I'm going to tweak that back for the other 3 episodes I'm recording today. Here's me and Witold. And I guess as a first question, how are you doing? How is life in the pandemic for you?
It's actually not affected me a great deal, and I probably should explain why. First of all, I'm retired from teaching, so the upheaval that has taken place in universities with distance teaching and everybody online has not affected me, and I haven't had to deal with that whole situation. Secondly, since I'm a writer, I spent the last 30 years, I've spent most mornings working on my own. So being alone in that sense is not a different habit than I normally have. And finally, personally, my wife Shirley broke her arm in February. So we were housebound for about a month before the Pennsylvania lockdown occurred. And most of my concentration really has been on helping her and dealing with the house and cooking and all of those things, because being one-handed is surprisingly limiting. You suddenly discover there are all sorts of things you just can't do. So I've had my mind on other things in an odd way. So while it's affected our lives, and in terms of, I try to shop once a week rather than frequently, and I have to line up at the store and all of that. It certainly hasn't been as serious as many people who have lost employment and have had their lives really turned upside down.
Sure. Which is good to hear. There's a degree that almost anyone I record with, we're all privileged in certain respects, or at least we all know people who are still going to day jobs or delivery people, et cetera, that we know have it a lot worse than we do.
Yeah.
Did you find your writing, did you find any sort of mental period where you sort of needed to acclimate yourself to this?
Well, I'm editing or rereading or polishing, I should say, a manuscript of a book that I've been working on for a couple of years, but which is a history. It's a history of architecture. So in my writing, I'm really in the Renaissance or the Middle Ages or ancient Rome. So in a funny way, that sort of pulls you out of today completely. Mm-hmm. And you, in for half a day, you're trying to put yourself in the mind of a builder in another period. So that sort of moved me out of it. I did initially think maybe, and I talked to my editor at a magazine I write for, thinking about what effect the pandemic would have particularly on architecture. This was an architecture magazine, but
that's my next question. So.
Well, since then I've cooled off on that. I've read so many stupid articles, sort of jumping into how this has changed our lives, how it will change our lives. Will cities survive? Really kind of ridiculous things. So I think you really do need to have a bit of perspective when you set out to do this. And we really don't understand the nature of what's happening today. I mean, economically, it's unprecedented. Health-wise, it's not unprecedented at all, and we've had much worse plagues and pandemics than this. But economically, it's unprecedented. We've stopped the economy. A modern economy that's so complex, it's not the same. We compare it to the Great Depression, but it's quite different. The country's bigger, and the economy's extremely more complex. So we really don't know how this will play out. And so I think trying to anticipate is just silly. It does put me in mind of 9/11. People often make the comparison, although 9/11 really pales by comparison to this global event. But I don't know if you remember, at 9/11, people were speculating we would never build tall buildings again. Nobody would ever work in a tall high-rise, which was all quite untrue. I mean, we built tall buildings not only on the site of 9/11, but all over the place, much taller than the World Trade Center tower. So I think I've cooled off on that, and I don't think I haven't been thinking about what all this means, because I don't think we know what it means. I think it's in a year's time, perhaps we might speculate about what it means, but it's just too big and too complicated, I think.
Sure. And I would think the impetus for that is simply the discovery that people can work from home. And if people can work from home more effectively, what does that mean for office space, and what does that mean for building office buildings? And that leads to the architecture question.
But we always knew that. I mean, we always knew that.
Yeah, but employers didn't want to admit it.
No, and many. I worked at a university, so of course that was different. But many employers did have days when you could work at home, and people had particular times when they were working at home. So I think that it's the big change, I would guess, will happen to higher educational institutions like universities and colleges. They're going to go through a very rough time. It's not at all clear to me that people will want to pay lots of money to have their kids study things that they could just pick off the internet, and not. For years, we've convinced ourselves, one falsely or truly, I'm not sure which, that the university experience was so important because it was a place. It was the face-to-face contact. It was the experience of that particular environment, the beautiful old buildings in many Ivy League universities. And so suddenly we're sort of turning around and saying, oh, no, that's not really important. You can get all the information staying at home. I don't think that is going to wash. So I think there's going to be some major changes. I don't know what they will be, but it's hard to imagine that we can go back to the previous situation. And of course, many universities are big enough to weather it with serious cutbacks. I mean, Penn, where I used to teach, has already frozen hiring, and I imagine in a few months, when they know how many students are actually going to come back next semester, if there is a next semester, they'll have to sort of reorganize teaching and courses and various other things. Many American universities, of course, depended on foreign students to a huge extent.
Sure.
Especially graduate schools like the design school at Penn. And, are we going to have all these students from China, particularly, coming to the United States or not? Whether or not they'll be welcome is another question, but will they come? And they were financially very important in supporting the budgets of universities. So there's a lot of questions that we don't know the answers to, but many businesses or enterprises will be affected in major ways, one would guess.
Mm-hmm. Are you, even though you're in a higher risk group because of your age, et cetera, are you happier to be on the outside of the workforce based on all of these unpredictabilities and everything that's going on? Or you're sort of happy that your livelihood isn't tied directly into this stuff now?
I'm in a much easier situation. If you're starting out teaching, you're very flexible. Mm-hmm. You don't really, you haven't developed teaching habits and techniques and, polished your way of approaching teaching. But if you're at the end of your career, as I would be if I was still teaching, it would be much more difficult to make the switch, to reorganize all your material so that it makes sense if a student is looking at it on a screen. So I think I'm happy not to have to deal with all that, because it would be sort of like telling me that I have to write in a totally different way than I've been doing for 30 years. It would be very difficult, if even possible, to do that. So I don't envy my older colleagues who have to make that switch. We're already reading things. Sitting in front of a computer is not the same thing as sitting in a classroom with other students and with the back and forth that can take place in a classroom, particularly if it's a smaller group. I think a large lecture probably works better. If you've got 100 students, the difference between sitting in front of a computer and sitting, in a very large auditorium is not as big. But a small seminar with half a dozen students and a kind of intimacy that brings is pretty hard to duplicate online.
Yeah, my graduate school was St. John's College in Annapolis, the Great Books conversation-based school. And I have no idea how it's going to adapt, especially for the undergrads. It's so much that seminar setting that you're describing, where it's just, half dozen to 15 people talking, and envisioning everybody as tiles on a screen is just a direction I wouldn't want to go in. But anyway, when we talked last year, it was the first time we'd spoken since you'd moved from the suburban home you were in to the middle of the city. At the time, that was, well, there were a number of reasons for it, but do you think now about the relative advantages of one versus the other, given the pandemic situation? Would it have been easier living out there, or is it really, really good that you're in the middle of the city now?
Yeah, it's sort of hard to say. I think it's we depend a lot on internet shopping, which wouldn't be any different if you were in the suburbs or in the city. It so happens that the supermarket I shop in, they're both within walking distance, which would not be the case in the suburbs. I would be totally dependent on a car to go shopping. So it's hard to say. I don't see it as. I think there are plus or minus on both sides. Strictly in terms of the pandemic, I know that many people have moved out of cities into their summer homes. I think there was a piece in the New York Times today about how certain neighborhoods, upper income neighborhoods in Manhattan were sort of 30% empty, because those people are all out in Long Island somewhere in their summer cottage. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily. I don't think that's necessary. From all we know about the pandemic, it's. I mean, a lot of these initial reactions were sort of essentially panicking and thinking, doing what people did really in the Middle Ages, which was leave the city and go somewhere else. But other than New York City, there hasn't necessarily been that connection between, urban density and the transference of the disease.
Yeah, I think New York was a unique locus for a number of reasons. So
mostly huge mistakes made by people running things.
Yeah,
not cleaning the subway,
right.
Sending the old folks to old folks' home. I mean, all of that was in hindsight, while well-meaning in some cases, turned out to be really disastrous. But that hasn't happened in other cities. So I mean, Philadelphia. The interesting thing with Philadelphia's center is that there aren't that many people living in the downtown Philadelphia. About less than 100,000 in the entire downtown. So it's not millions of people, and the sidewalks were never like New York, which really is crowded. And now you can walk down, I have to walk to this pharmacy or something, which is maybe 5 or 6 blocks away, and not necessarily meet anybody or pass anybody. So it isn't full of people in a sort of as the image of the city that we have. But certainly the suburbs are even less full because people are separated in cars, which in the short term is certainly safer than being outside.
Yeah, how has the city response been? Has there been any sort of cultural vibe about how Philadelphia deals with social isolation and quarantine?
I don't know. People are generally very. I've read about people reacting against, wearing masks or staying distance. When you line up at Trader Joe, which is where I shop, people are very patient and accommodating to each other. So I fantasize this has something to do with Quakerism, but I don't know. I don't know if that's true. But certainly people here seem to be, at least in downtown, seem to be resigned to doing these things. Otherwise, it's hard to say. It hasn't been. I mean, other than the lockdown, it's hard to see sort of initiatives being taken by the city. Stores take initiatives. They ask you to wear a mask, or they only let in a certain number of people at a time. So those are private initiatives rather than mandated. And so, as a city, I'm not sure what the city has done. The death rate is nothing like New York City, so there hasn't been that kind of crisis.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if there was anything that's a quintessentially Philadelphia way of dealing with a situation. But glad to hear it hasn't been drastic enough to, prompt something like that. Do you find yourself? Well, you've always been reading, non-architectural work as part of your more balanced life than I have. Do you find yourself returning to particular fiction? Is it Patrick O'Brian at this point, or other stuff that's kind of giving you solace?
I did. The only new book I've read recently was Mantel's third volume.
The Mirror and the Light
books. But I started an old Graham Greene book that I had noted in the flyleaf. I must have been in second year university when I bought it, the Istanbul train. And I'm just impressed what a remarkable author. He's sort of depressing, which is perhaps not the best thing to read at this particular time. A friend of mine mentioned that he isn't reading much fiction because it's hard to concentrate. And I think that there is some truth in that it's hard to read difficult, serious books in a period where your mind is always wandering off, and where whenever you read online, you're torn this way and that. So what Graham Greene called an entertainment actually fits the bill.
Oh,
I watch a lot of Netflix. I love very long series. It's like reading a Trollope novel. You know that you're going to be with it a long time, and you can sort of relax and almost get immersed with different characters and the story, whatever it is.
What have you been, what jumps to mind? What have you been binging on?
The recent one was a French one called, in French it's called 10%. In English it's called Call My Agent, I think. But it's about a Parisian office of agents that represents entertainers. And it's really fun to, first of all, it's dubbed so you can hear the French, which is nice to hear. And it's also interesting to see just a different way of life. So it's one of those office situation type of dramas, but the office is slightly different. And, everybody drinks wine at lunch, which I can relate to. And it's just different. And so it's a bit like traveling. Even though so much at the same time is the same, they're always saying things are cool, which I find that really irritating in English. But it's obviously
sounds good in French.
It's obviously moved internationally, so it's become a word that people. The French has become very English, according to this. Listening to this show, I haven't been in France for more than a decade, and judging from the way people speak here on the television, it's very influenced by English in many ways.
Yeah, where do you want to go if you were able to get on a plane or travel somewhere?
Actually, nowhere. Because traveling is much more difficult as you get older, I find. And some time ago, I came to terms with the fact that I'm not going to go to any places. Writing this history of architecture, I keep coming across buildings I wish I had seen. Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, or some of the buildings in Egypt or Iran, but I'm not going to jump on a plane and go and see them. It would be ridiculously uncomfortable and difficult to do that. So I've really come to terms with that. As you do when you get older, there are many things you can't do. I don't ski anymore. I don't run anymore. So many things change, and there are limits. And for me, traveling is one of them, partly because traveling is so unpleasant, has become so unpleasant, but also you're much more demanding as you get old. You get set in your habits, and traveling breaks all those habits, of course. And when you're younger, that's very attractive. And we used to go, when we went on vacation, we would never reserve ahead of time. We would just go somewhere and, figure it out as you go along. I don't think I would be comfortable doing that anymore. It would be too hectic. So no, there's no place that I would literally enjoy going to now, or I should say, imagine going to.
Okay. As opposed to like revisiting Charleston or.
Well, I had been going to Charleston a lot when I was writing the book and after, that is more like visiting people than visiting a place for me. I mean, I've got to know a lot of people there that I wrote about, and it's fun to see them and see what they're up to. But in terms of, say, there are many places that I wish I had seen that I've never been to, but that's just not going to happen. And I can't say I miss it. It's just a reality.
I get you. Have you been in contact with old friends during this and people you hadn't been in touch with? Either checking in with you or you checking in with them? Just, I haven't talked to blah, blah, blah in years. Let me just see how they're doing.
Not a little bit, but not a great. I've been in contact with people that I've sort of kept in touch with over the years. An old classmate, for example, that we had lost touch, but sort of through the internet we had reconnected, and we regularly email back and forth. But not so much. I think very little. Generally, it's been people that I have some previous contact with that I continue that contact.
Understood. And last question, what's the timeline for the architectural history? And second question to that, if we're past the pandemic at that point, is it cool for me to come down and sit down and record another conversation with you about it?
The timeline is long. I thought it would take longer to write than it did. So yeah. I forget my deadline is the beginning of next year, I think. And at first, back at the beginning of this year, I thought, I'll finish it off and get it out there more quickly. And now obviously this is about the worst time you could imagine to publish a book. So I haven't rushed ahead. Instead, I've taken my time and gone back over things. And it's a very long book, and it's complicated because you're having to describe things, buildings, and so I've been really polishing and editing and going back. It's an illustrated book. There are a lot of illustrations, and so going back and thinking about, is this the best picture I can find, or how does it really fit in properly? So I'm not rushing. So it won't be until the beginning of next year that it'll come out. Well, which will be probably spring of next year. But certainly I'd be happy to talk about it.
In fact, we may as well do that as a precursor. Is there a thesis connected to the history? I just don't know how one composes this. I don't know.
Right now, the working title is The Story of Architecture, and it was very much influenced by Gombrich's Story of Art. And so it's a book that's written for somebody who doesn't necessarily know a lot about architecture. So it doesn't assume previous knowledge. Gombrich wrote his book, he said, for teenagers. It's a classic. It was written, I forget, in the 50s, and it's still in print. Because it's wonderfully written, and it gives you a sense of the whole. So the idea is not to write an encyclopedia that you refer to, but rather a book that you can actually read. It has a narrative, so you get a sense of why things change and how they change over time. The main theme of the book is to look at architecture not as art historians do, which tends to be to focus on the works of art, the way you focus on a painting or a sculpture, but to look at the practice of architecture, because I think what distinguishes architecture from the other arts is that it's the clients are very important, the means of construction are very important, the uses of the building are very important. All things which are not necessarily key when you're looking at a painting. And so it looks at individual buildings, but it tries to put them in a context so that you learn about the architect or the client or the way the building was built or the various things that surround architecture, rather than simply isolating, Notre Dame Cathedral and saying how beautiful it is and what goes on there. I think it's an attempt to broaden the sense so that we understand architecture as this art form that is very unusual because it deals so much with practicalities, and it's affected by things like clients and budgets and taste and changing ideas about what a building should look like. Almost every building in the book still exists. I mean, some of the ancient buildings only exist as ruins. They're not necessarily used, although the Pantheon in Rome is still used as a church. But that's also an important part of the book, the fact that buildings last such a long time in a practical sense. I mean, they're used for a very long time. Most of the great buildings, of Michelangelo or even some of the Roman buildings are still in use. They're not relics or ruins, or they're antiques in the sense that they're old, but they're not like an antique, gun that you hang on the wall, but you don't actually fire it because you have a modern gun if you want to shoot a gun. Whereas an old building is lived in and used and looked at and appreciated in a way that makes it part of our lives, not just an antique. And I think that's a part of architecture that really interests me, because I think it changes the way we think about buildings. When you read architecture magazines, you get the sense that there are only modern buildings in the world. But of course, the most important buildings to most people are very old. The Empire State Building, or an old museum, or an old church, and they don't think of them as old. It's just part of the skyline, or part of what you pass every morning on the way, or an old office building that you work in. And so there's an interesting connection between the past and the present, which doesn't necessarily exist in the other arts. In the other arts, except in certain things like music, where the music of the 18th century just is really part of the present day as much as the 18th century. So buildings are more like that. They just they're part of our present.
I'm dying to read this now, and even more importantly, to just be able to sit down across a table from you and have a conversation. So we will hope by next year that's feasible.
I certainly do hope that's the case.
So thanks for coming on. I hope your wife's arm heals up just fine, and we'll keep our fingers crossed for next spring.
Okay. Thanks, Gil.
Thanks, Witold. And that was Witold Rybczynski. Go check out his website, witoldrybczynski.com, to find out more about his books, check out his occasional blogs, look wistfully at his events calendar, since all events are either off the table or gone virtual. The spelling and URL will be in the show and episode notes, but tradition's tradition, so that is WITOLDRYBCZYNSKI.com. Witold Rybczynski, spelled just like it sounds. He's also on Twitter as Witold R, WITOLD, and the letter R, all one word. Go read his books. It's not just architecture. It's about, what he talked about in the end of the episode, about what these buildings mean, what they come to mean over time, how they're different from other forms of art, go find his most recent Charleston Fancy, How Architecture Works, the Perfect House, City Life, Mysteries of the Mall, and other essays. There's a whole lot. He's really published a lot of good, thoughtful work. Again, not just about architecture, but design and urban planning and how people live, you know? Anyway, we'll be back on Monday with another COVID check-in. If you want to send me a little update to read on the air or have something you want to share with listeners, let me know and we'll set something up. I'm at groth18, GROTH18 @gmail.com. You can find my contact info at my websites, vmspod.com and chimeraobscura.com/VM. Both sites also have a link to the COVID-19 sessions, which captures all of these shows that I've done daily pretty much since March 25th. You can also just subscribe to the Virtual Memory Show via iTunes, Spotify, TuneIn, or whatever podcatcher you like. The RSS feed's available at both our sites, and that way you can make sure you get every episode, and you can also go through the archives of about 370 in-person shows I did before the pandemic. Now, in the before times, I always recorded in person, but now I'm using Zencastr.com so I can record remotely. If you're interested in figuring that stuff out, using it for yourself, it is ZENCASTR, so Zencastr with no final E. There's a free hobby level to try out, as well as a pro level that's $20 a month. My Patreon supporters more than cover the expense for this show, both that $20 a month and the $20 I now spend on podcast hosting service for all the episodes I'm putting up. But I'm also not spending any money on tolls, parking, subway trips, coffee, etc. for those in-person shows. So really, I'm doing just fine. My supporters more than cover what I'm doing. So what I'm saying is, if you can spare anything right now, give it to the artists and writers and other creative people you like through their Patreons, Kickstarters, Indiegogos, GoFundMes, tip jars, whatever. Show them some support. If you see GoFundMes for people in real need, give. If there are charities you can give to or your local food bank, do what you can. Help people in need. Now, I am Gil Roth. It is Saturday, May 16th, 2020, and this was a bonus episode of my Virtual Memory Show podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Keep the conversation going, stay safe, and wash your damn hands.